So this talk is going to focus on food production methods and food safety. So as part of this topic overview, we're going to consider the various aspects around food production methods and food safety. So we're going to look at some of the legislation and some aspects relating to HACCP. Then when we come together for synchronous lecture, we're going to look at food-related illnesses and consequences. So we're going to look at bacterial, viral, fungal and others. And then we're going to characterise the key factors, consequences and symptoms related to foodborne illnesses as part of our discussion. So the learning outcomes for this topic are to be able to identify the various methods of food production and safety, be able to describe the types of foodborne illnesses and consequences, and to be able to identify key facts around foodborne illness. So if we think about where our food comes from, there is an increasing centralisation and globalisation of all of our foods. And this increases the likelihood of pandemics of foodborne illnesses. So if we think about, for example, where our oranges come from, often they're from Brazil or they're from South Africa. For example, Manchtu will come from, and green beans will come from Kenya or Peru. Our strawberries out of season may come from Spain. So a lot of the food that we eat is not actually grown in this country, so it's grown elsewhere. So people in developing countries are at greater risk from naturally occurring toxicants and foodborne disease and contaminants within the food chain. And there is, so what has been identified in order to try and curtail some of these risks and control for them is to develop something called the Hazard Analysis Critical Control Point concept, so HACCP, which has been really essential and fundamental in assessing and managing risk. There's also incredibly special consideration regarding fish and shellfish, as that's a particular risk for contaminant. And that there needs to be a concerted action to prohibit the use of antibiotics as growth promoters in animal production, as this not only impacts on animal husbandry health, but also our own health as well, and particularly the rise of antibiotic-resistant bacteria. So internationally, we need to have agreed food standards, as these are essential to facilitate trade in food between areas, particularly with food surpluses and those with food deficits as well. So in terms of agriculture, so obviously this relates to the production of food, feeding products, fibre and other desired products by the cultivation of certain plants and the raising of domesticated animals. So overall, on average, 83% of the food consumed by humans is produced using terrestrial agriculture. And obviously there are risks associated with this, and there are food hazards. So obviously there are risks associated with nutritional deficiency. So it's high in developing countries, but obviously much lower in developed countries. Nutritional imbalances, for example, obesity, excess intakes of salt, saturated and trans fatty acids is moderate to low, although that's probably changing in particularly with regards to obesity and the double burden of malnutrition in developing countries and high in developed countries, and that there are naturally occurring toxicants in foods, alkaloids, legumes. There are aflatoxins, so certainly in developing countries that's high, and in developed countries that's low. And then you've got microbial contaminants, sort of parasites, mold, etc. Again, high in developing countries and moderate in developed countries. And then contaminants in food, such as heavy metals, organic chemicals. So heavy metals are often found in fish, so fish that have a very long lifespan, so such as tuna, marlin, they often have high levels of mercury within them. So it's recommended that not more than 2 portions of these fish should be eaten per week. So it's moderate in developing countries and low following those guidelines in developed countries. So the risk analysis framework was set out really to try and better identify those critical control points where hazards were associated. So obviously we do risk assessment, so we look for hazard identification, hazard characterization, we do an exposure assessment, and then risk categorization. And then as part of a risk management policy, we come up with policy alternatives. So what can we do to prevent those from happening? We look at implementing appropriate options, and we look at an interactive exchange of information and of opinion. So there may be experts or people with experience who are both external and within an organisation, and sort of their advice and support needs to help shape policy. And then obviously we need to think about risk communication. So who needs to know about this? How are we going to communicate it? So if we're working with the workforce, how best to communicate the risks associated with certain aspects of food production and food safety. Is it pictorially done? Is it done as part of an HACCP flowchart? So how do we make sure that everyone knows of what policies are in place? So obviously we're aiming to prevent massive outbreaks of food poisoning. In the last few years, there have been a number of outbreaks of particularly of salmonella. In the sort of early 90s, mid 90s, there was an outbreak of salmonella in infant formula that killed a lot of babies in Europe. And then there was a particular concern regarding certain bacteria in other infant formula, and that it wasn't killed by high temperatures, or it wasn't killed, it was prevalent in infant formula because that's not sterile. Klebsiella was one of them. So it was really important that they and that's how the WHO came about with their infant milk preparation. So HACCP virus bacteria was considered resulted in a number of deaths. So the WHO came up with some new guidelines for the use of infant formula and production methods, both at home and within a hospital. So previously, infant milk was made up with cooled boiled water, and there was a change that milk powder had to be made up with boiling water. So the water temperature had to be of a certain level, and then it had to be left to cool in order to kill off any bacteria within the milk. And then obviously there are other outbreaks that have been associated with food. So legislation in the UK is previously known as the Food Standard Agency, FSA, is now part of the Department of Health. And the FSA, or Department of Health, is responsible for food safety and food hygiene across the UK. So they work with local authorities to enforce food safety regulations, and staff work across the UK as part of food processing facilities to check and enforce that standards are being met and offer advice. So environmental health officers have a very key role in this, and obviously, you know, we'll see in the television programmes, they'll go and visit an establishment to make sure that they are keeping up to the environmental health and legislative standards. Food safety legislation is very complex, and it's ever changing. So it's there to protect businesses and consumers. And as part of a business, it's made to ensure that all food handlers are trained to handle food appropriately and safely and hygienically. So everyone has to have training. And it also makes sure that working conditions are good, so that food handlers themselves are able to comply with the legislation. So are food handlers given the appropriate equipment, so PPE equipment, to make sure that they are protecting themselves from either becoming infected with foodborne illnesses or protecting others from getting foodborne illnesses. So they help prevent customers from making false claims about being ill after eating food. And then from a consumer's perspective, the legislation helps prevent them from becoming ill after eating, and ensures that manufacturers of food maintain the highest of standards to prevent this from occurring. So there are a number of things that food handlers should do that can prevent food poisoning. Obviously, nails should be kept short and clear of nail varnish. So obviously, any bacteria can embed itself under the sort of nail if you've got long nails. Hair must be tied back, and hair and facial hair covered with a net. People who are working with food should keep themselves clean. Jewellery and watches should be removed as they can harbour bacteria, even those with stones. And plain wedding bands are the only thing that are allowed. Outer clothing such as jumpers need to be taken off, and arms should be bare below the elbows. So protective clothing should be worn to prevent bacteria from your clothes contaminating food. So it's not to prevent your clothes from getting dirty, it's actually to stop your clothes from contaminating the food that's being made. So in terms of personal hygiene, obviously it's really important, more so than ever, is to hands should always be washed with hot soapy water before and after handling food. Sneeze or cough away from food, and wash hands after blowing nose. And a food handler must inform their employer if they have any symptoms of food poisoning. So if they've got any vomiting, diarrhea, then they mustn't come to work. And it's important to note that a carrier can be infected but not show symptoms. So in terms of the legislation is concerned with a range of issues in relation to production of, sale and consumption of food. So really all it does is trying to make food safe for human consumption. So it's making sure that we have checks in place and control the composition and the labelling of food. So particularly, for example, with regarding to all of the food allergens, there are it's legal stipulation that if you've got one of the 14 included within the food, then you need to put that on the label. It prevents food from becoming contaminated, prevents outbreaks of food poisoning, and ensures equipment, food handlers and premises are hygienic. And then it also ensures that food handlers are trained to understand and implement food and hygiene safety practices. Make sure that temperature and other controls are correct for the processing, storage and preparation and consumption of food. So obviously if you're reheating a pie, for example, it's got hot enough in the centre so that you're not going to get food poisoning. Ensures water supply and food handler toilet and washing facilities are safe and hygienic, and ensures that businesses have implemented a food safety management system which is compliant based on risk assessment through HACCP. So all sectors along the whole food industry are covered by legislation. So it's not just those who are making food, it's also food production. So farmers, crop pickers, abattoirs, fishing boats and fish farms are all covered by this legislation. Food processing and food product manufacture, so dairies, mills, vegetable washing, packing stations, bakeries, factories, wineries, small independent producers of food and food packing manufacturers are all covered by this legislation. Warehouse, storage and food distribution areas. So obviously you want the warehouses to be clean, you want them to be free of pests and pesticides. So you want to make sure that the food doesn't become contaminated after it's been produced. So you've got warehouse delivery vans and lorries and takeaway deliveries. And then obviously at the sort of consumer end, it's the preparation and sale of food. So supermarkets, restaurants, cafes, hotels, guest houses, etc. So the original Food Safety Act 1990 applied to all food businesses, including charities and not-for-profit. And there are three main laws. So the Food Safety Act 1990, General Food Law Regulations of 2004, and then the Food Safety and Hygiene Regulations of 2013. So the Act doesn't cover food prepared in home for domestic use, but it covers all other food. So once food is purchased from a retail situation, market, supermarket, stall, it's the responsibility of the consumer to ensure that the food is transported, stored, prepared, cooked, and served at home in a safe manner. The Act is requires all food businesses to ensure that all food they produce for sale is safe to eat, what people expect it to be, and not labelled, advertised, or that is false or misleading. So the General Food Law Regulations of 2004 and 4 were developed by the Food Safety Act in line with the principles and recommendations of the EU regulations. So that's EC number 178/2002. And these were giving enforcement powers to the FSA and Fourth Health Authority in order to protect, search, seize food that could potentially be dangerous or harmful. The Food Safety and Hygiene regulations in England, 2013, these regulations applied to all types of foods and drinks and their ingredients, and they applied to all stages of food production, except primary production, e.g. sort of harvesting, milking, catching fish. So under these regulations, anyone who owns or manages or works in the food business must develop a system of compliance to ensure that food safety controls are in place, and that they're always followed and regularly maintained and reviewed. It's important to make sure that food is handled, supplied and sold in a hygienic way. It identifies potential food safety hazards in the operation and activities of food business, and knows which stages in their food handling activity are critical for food safety, and identifies at which stages things could go wrong. So these are the important critical control points. And these have been put into place to prevent risk to food safety. And this is all achieved through HACCP. So it's mandatory for every food organisation to have HACCP flow diagrams and guidelines identifying where the critical control points are. So this is HACCP. So this is the acronym stands for Hazard Analysis Critical Control Point. And really the aim of HACCP for businesses is consider each stage of their production. So it looks at step by step and identifies and analyses where there are potential risks to food safety and decides then what controls need to be put in place. So for example, if we look at storage of food, so cold storage mustn't be allowed to be above 5 degrees for fresh fish, shellfish and ready meals, or minus 18 degrees C for frozen fish and shellfish. Otherwise, there's risk of bacterial growth. So the critical control points that have been put in place is that refrigeration and freezer temperatures are regularly checked and recorded in a logbook, and refrigerator and freezer motors and door seals are checked regularly and serviced, and that alarms make a warning noise if the temperature exceeds the safe limits, and these must be fitted to freezers, and stored food is regularly checked, and you have a rotation, so first in, first out. You stock rotate, so it means that you don't just keep on putting food, the food doesn't get further and further towards the back. So this is what an HACCP diagram looks like. So you've got a critical control point, so you've got pickers, croppers, and these are all the different critical control points within a processing plant. So food premises, so there are a number of basic requirements for food safety and food hygiene, and these take into consideration the design. So you can't have your waste disposal, you can't have your raw food next to your cooked food. So they think about layout, they think about construction, and they think about maintenance. So they must be designed in such a way that you've got sufficient ventilation, pest control, clean toilets, you've got an area to wash food, you've got an area to move food waste, and you've got preparation areas, and you've got storage of cleaning materials that are well away from food production. So buying ingredients, in order to prevent multiple bacterial multiplication and reduce the risk of food poisoning, ingredients should only be bought from a reputable supplier or shop. Food should be ensured that it's in good quality, so there's no mold, and packaging shouldn't be damaged. And tins, particularly the big, massive tins, shouldn't be dented or blown, so they shouldn't have a dome. If they've got a dome top rather than flat, then that's blown, because air has potentially been able to enter and damage the tin, allowing the bacteria to multiply to dangerous levels. So food purchase, food bought should be used within date. Chilled or frozen food should be picked out at the end of a shopping trip. red meat or meat and poultry should be stored in a separate bag to the rest of people's shopping, and a cool bag and ice blocks pack chilled and frozen food together. And once people get home, they should put the food into a fridge or freezer as soon as possible. So in terms of food dates, there are 2 dates of marks that are legal requirements in the UK. So there's use by. So this is important. You shouldn't use food after the use by date. It's highly perishable food, packaged food such as cooked meat, fish, dairy products and ready meals. They must by law be marked with the use date. So we shouldn't use any food or drink after the date that is shown on one of the label, even if it looks and smells fine, because you can't always see, smell or taste the bacteria that causes food poisoning. So it's very important to note it's against the law to sell or serve food beyond its use by date. Best before is different. So you can eat food that is outside of the best before date. So it's safe to eat. It might not be the quality that you would normally expect, but you can still eat it. So for example, a bag of sugar snap peas, their best before date was the 20th of December, and you only come to eat them on Christmas Day. They will still be fine. They might not taste quite the same, but they are best before. They're not this. So this appears on less perishable foods such as tinned or frozen foods, bags of flour, crisps, biscuits, along with bottles of cans of food and drink. So food might begin to lose some of its flavour, a little bit of its texture. So for chocolate that's really out of date, you might get a white bloom. So you can still eat it with a white bloom. It's probably not going to taste as good as it normally does, but it doesn't mean that it's going to cause you ill health. So in terms of time and temperature control, there are danger zones where bacteria grow most readily, and that's between 5 and 63 degrees C. So if you keep food outside of the danger zone, then you're less likely to get food poisoning. So obviously 37 degrees C is the body temperature, and it's an optimum temperature for bacterial growth. 8 degrees C is the maximum legal temperature for cold food. So your domestic fridge at home probably runs around 6 to 8 degrees C. And it's really important that you have a fridge thermometer, so you should check your fridge temperature regularly. 5 degrees C is the ideal temperature your fridge should be. The aim is not to overfill your fridge. If you have your fridge too full, then the air that is needed to circulate to keep the fridge cold can't. Minus 18 degrees C, the temperature your freezer should be at. You should never put warm food in a freezer, because what that does is raise the temperature of the rest of the food within the freezer compartment, and that then increases the risk of bacterial contamination. 70 degrees C, which is the cooking at this temperature or above, will kill most bacteria. And if you don't have a food probe, then just make sure your food is boiling hot. 85 degrees C is the food that should be reheated to, and you should only reheat food once. So don't keep reheating food and then refreezing or rechilling. You can only reheat it once, and after which it must be thrown away. Cooling food quickly. So in order to reduce the risk of bacterial multiplication, hot food should be cold enough to go in a fridge within 90 minutes. So in big food manufacturing plants, or for example in some hospitals where they're trying to chill milk quickly, you will have something called a blast chiller. So that will chill the food or milk within between 30 and 90 minutes. So it can also be achieved by at home by dividing dishes into smaller portions. So fish pie, this increases the surface area, it means quicker cooling. Decanting food into chilled containers or ice baths, using cooling areas but not the fridge or the freezer, so having a cold place within a food production area, or running cold water for cooling rice and pasta. So rice is one of those fairly innocuous looking things, but it can be very dangerous. So rice can be contaminated with spores or the food poisoning bacteria Bacillus cereus. So these spores protect the bacteria during cooking, and they prevent them from being destroyed. So when rice is left at warm temperatures between 5 and 63 degrees and not kept hot or cold, the spores will pop and they release the bacteria and they multiply inside. So the longer rice is kept at a warm temperature, the more bacteria they will grow and multiply. And these bacteria produce a special toxin chemical, which can cause an illness. And the toxin is not destroyed even when the rice is reheated. So rice is one of those really funny things, is that often we think, oh, you know, we've had a curry, we've got some spare rice, we'll keep it and we'll use it tomorrow. Actually, you probably shouldn't. It's probably one of those things that is, there is a really high risk of food poisoning. So things like rice salad and stuff like that, you have to be really careful about what and how you make it. So the 4 C's that are a really good way of remembering rules around food hygiene: cleaning, cooking, chilling, cross-contamination. So cleaning, you can prevent the spread of harmful bacteria by keeping your hands, work surfaces and utensils clean. Cooking, proper cooking skills ensure that harmful bacteria that cause food poisoning are killed, and it's important to cook food, especially meat, thoroughly. Chilling, really important to keep certain foods at the right temperature to prevent bacteria growing and toxins from forming. Always look at the food label to see whether food should be kept in the fridge. And if you're not sure, just put it in the fridge. For example, I always keep bread in the fridge or freezer. It reduces mold. Cross-contamination, this is where bacteria can spread from one food to another. So an example would be raw foods touching or dripping onto ready-to-eat foods, dirty equipment, pests, or poor personal hygiene. So it's like having putting a piece of raw chicken on top of some cooked meat. Your chances of food poisoning are probably quite high. And then the challenge of the future is that one of our major constraints is going to be the availability of water, and is going to be a major constraint in food production in many parts of the world. And really, we're going to need to have every effort to conserve water for food production in the future. So this is the end of this presentation. Thank you for your attention, and we will meet again during the week.